Welcome all, and thank you for joining today's Adbri webinar. My name is Matt Holdstock, and I will be your webinar host this morning. In today's session, we will venture into the vineyard with a webinar titled Vineyard Biodiversity, Supporting the Sustainable Management of Scale Insects and Other Pests. In the spirit of reconciliation, the Adbri acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to the land, sea, and the community. We pay our respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. I'd also like to acknowledge Wine Australia for providing the funding and support for the webinar program via the Adbri's Extension and Communication Project. But before we jump in and make a start, a couple of quick reminders to anyone who is new to the webinar platform. If you'd like to provide a comment or ask a question throughout, click on the Q&A button on the Zoom toolbar, type in your question and click to send it through. We will hold a Q&A session at the end of the presentation, but feel free to send in your questions at any stage throughout. A reminder also that this session is being recorded, and this link will be sent through to you later to view via the Adbri's YouTube channel. For anyone who's just joined, welcome. Today's webinar topic is Vineyard Biodiversity, Supporting the Sustainable Management of Scale Insects and Other Pests. And it is with great pleasure to welcome Professor Jeff Gurr from Charles Sturt University. Jeff is a distinguished professor of applied ecology at Charles Sturt University. His work over the last 3 decades has focused on developing ecological-based strategies to harmonise agricultural practices with the environment. In addition, the team that Jeff runs utilises these capabilities to address the underlying biological drivers of avocado irregular bearing to develop practical management tools aimed at stabilising production for international and domestic market development. So Jeff, if you're ready to make a start, I'll just get you to share your screen there and I'll hand over to you.
Okay, Matt. Now, I've not touched my controls since we did the test sharing a short time ago.
Yes.
Can you toggle across, or do I need to?
You just share your screen,
Yeah,
share,
okay.
and then go to your presentation.
There we go. That should be it. Just there.
Just go full screen. Yeah, great. Thank you.
Okay, am I good to go? Well, yeah, thank you, Matt, and welcome everyone. I've been working in vineyards for about 25 years from an ecology perspective, and over the past 2 years, I've been coordinating a project out of Charles Sturt University in which we've been trying to bring some of this ecological expertise to the challenge of scale insects. And this presentation will give you an insight into how far we've got with that. So I think to start off, I'll just cover a few basics in case scale insects are new to some people in the audience. One perhaps useful way of thinking about scale insects is as couch potato aphids, because they're closely related to aphids, which are, I think, a more familiar type of insect to most people. But the reason I refer to them as couch potato aphids is because they adopt this sedentary lifestyle where they just anchor themselves to the plant on which they're feeding and they don't move. At least that's the case for the adult females, which are the most conspicuous life stage, the type of scale that you're most likely to see on a host plant. But do keep in mind that the juveniles, or crawlers as they're often referred to, as well as the males, are motile. They move around, but they're much smaller and more inconspicuous. Now, scale insects do attack many different crop species, and several of them, which I'll introduce in a moment, attack grapevines. Like the aphids that I touched on a short time ago, they suck the sap from the host plant. More technically correct is to say they take the phloem. And because phloem, it contains a great deal of carbohydrates in the form of sugars and very little nitrogenous nutrients, the poor old scales have to consume a huge amount of phloem liquid in order to get sufficient nitrogenous compounds, amino acids. And so they end up having to excrete very large amounts of the excess sugars in the form of honeydew. And the honeydew that's excreted by these insects can form a sticky layer over the plant surfaces, and that's colonized by sooty mold and can lead to bunch rejection. Like many sucking insects, the scale insects will vector viral diseases, and the main one of concern, particularly in Australia, is called Charles disease. Now, aphids, almost called them aphids, scale insects are attacked by a suite of parasitoid wasps, and I'll introduce those a little later, but also some more generalist predators, including beetles, lacewings, spiders, and birds. And finally, for this very general introduction slide, scale insects are generally thought to be of growing importance in Australia, possibly due to climate change. So transitioning from the previous slide, which is very much a general intro to scale insects as a group, to the major species that can potentially be found in Australian vineyards, I've summarised them on this slide here. But the one that you probably need to be most conscious of is the grapevine scale at the top of the screen there. And so those sedentary adult females that I referred to previously, they're around 7 millimeters long, oval shaped and darkish brown in colour. The common names of these insects that you see there in bold are a reasonably good kind of shorthand description of what the adult females look, but don't fall into the kind of assumption that they're easy to identify, because the immatures that I mentioned earlier differ in appearance, and they're small, they're cryptic in as much as they often shelter below bark fragments and other hard to see places. And so scale insects can be very hard to find and identify in the vineyard, and I think it's fair to say they're often overlooked. Given the difficulty in finding and recognizing scale insects, it's perhaps worth mentioning that ants are a really useful kind of giveaway sign of scale infestation in a vineyard. And this is the case because previously I described the way in which the scale insects produce lots of honeydew as a waste product of their feeding. And the honeydew is a very, very nice food resource for other insects, most notably ants. And so ants will effectively farm scale insects in a way that's quite similar to the way that humans might farm dairy cattle. And because the ants are protective of their livestock, if you happen to disturb them, then they are likely to become quite aggressive and very active. So yeah, keep in mind that ants are a useful way of kind of early detecting scale insect presence in the vineyard. Now, I've summarised on this very simple slide here, well, relatively simple, what is quite a complex picture in terms of the life cycle of scale insects. It's generally assumed in Australia in vineyards that our scale has one generation a year, but there is some uncertainty attached to this because when you make field observations, you can often see multiple life stages present at any one time. And so either we've got more than one generation, or we've got asynchrony in terms of the stage of development. But the broad assumption is that Well, following the winter where we are now, the females will mature and start to produce eggs. And then as conditions start to warm up in the spring, the eggs, which had been held underneath the body, underneath the protective scale of the female, the eggs will start to hatch. And those young crawlers that I described previously, they'll start to disperse on the foliage, and they can also be dispersed by wind. And so keep in mind that managing scale insects is not necessarily a kind of a very local field by field or block by block exercise, because these crawlers could blow in at that stage of the year from other locations. Later in the growing season, as those young scale insects are dispersing and feeding and growing, the berries can become infested. And then towards the autumn, the juveniles, the slightly larger nymphs, tend to move towards the more woody parts of the plant. And then as we progress into winter, the large juveniles will seek shelter in bark crevices and spend the winter in those semi-protected locations. All right, so let me transition now to talking about the specific piece of work that we conducted. Our scale sampling method involved 6 New South Wales vineyards, and each of these blocks was visited in the summer and the winter. And during those visits, sampling positions were identified in the central area of each block, but also in the edges of the vineyard, in order to give us some understanding of whether the adjacent land uses, whether it's grassland or other vineyards or other sorts of enterprises, did have a bearing on the level of scale in the focal vineyard. And at each of those positions indicated with the red spots, we selected between 5 and 10 vines for a detailed inspection. And in the winter months, that focused on the spurs, and in the summer, of course, on the canes, including the foliage and the bunches. And ultimately, the numbers of insects that were counted there were expressed as mean per vine to allow aggregation and analysis of the data. So on to a few slides that relate to our results. Scale insects were detected on most sites and most visits, even in instances of where the owner or manager wasn't aware of infestation or was inclined to think they didn't have a scale insect problem. And that comes back to the point I made earlier, that these can be quite inconspicuous pests and easy to overlook. The scale insects were present on many plant parts, and we can see them in these pictures: canes, petioles, the leaves and the berries. And the vast majority of those visualized were grapevine scale, with occasional frosted scale detected. The distribution of scale in our focal vineyards that we sampled was extremely patchy, with many zeros in our data sets and many low values. And you can see that reflected here in this frequency distribution of our observations. So let's now take a look at 6 of the vineyards, and I'm showing you here the means for winter 2023, summer 24, winter 24, and most recently summer 25. And some of the, I think perhaps most noteworthy findings are that the cooler district vineyard here, which was in the orange district, had the highest numbers initially, but following the application of winter oil, a paraffinic oil, the scale insects were well controlled. The other vineyards were all in warmer riverina locations. And amongst those, the organic vineyard, this one here, had intermediate numbers of scale insects. And I think we can draw two messages from that. And one is that having organic practices in place, whereby there was no use of synthetic insecticides or other synthetic pesticides, did not mean that there was some kind of nirvana of flourishing natural enemy communities that kept scale insects in check. Organic properties, it seems, can be vulnerable to infestation by scale insects. Now, I mentioned earlier that we made a point of sampling scale from the center of vineyard blocks, but also the edges. And the data from this kind of partitioning of the results was it was a noisy data set. But what we can draw from this, I think, is that we had the lowest numbers of scale insects in vineyard edges that were adjacent to grassland. I'm referring to this mean value here. And I think what this is suggesting is that the absence of alternative hosts meant that there was very limited opportunities for scale insects to spill over into the adjacent edge of the vineyard. And for those that know anything at all about scale insects, you don't tend to find these on grassy and herbaceous vegetation. Scale insects tend to be more specialized feeders on perennial woody plants. So that's, I think, why we're seeing low numbers here compared with this value here, which is for the centers of the vineyards. But at the other extreme, we have a category of edge here against built infrastructure. And what I mean by this, it's the sheds and buildings. It can be cellar doors. And often these have landscape features, shrubs and trees and hedges and so on. And I think possibly what's happening here is that we've got relatively high numbers of scale insects in the vineyard borders adjacent to these land uses, reflecting a spillover. That is, that some of the plants in those areas could be harboring scale insects, which can easily move across into adjacent areas of the vineyards. Now, the other thing that was detected in the field surveys was these parasitoid exit holes. And you can see ringed here in each case a grapevine scale adult female, but a circular puncture wound in each of these, which is where a parasitic wasp has exited from the scale, having completed its development and fed on the insides of that unfortunate scale insect host. So let me just take a couple of slides now that will move us into the wonderful world of parasitoids. These have been the subject of much deeper dive projects than the one I'm reporting on today, most notably by Greg Buchanan. And in the work that he's previously conducted and reported, it was found that a particular parasitoid called Metaphycus was the most abundant and effective parasitoid of grapevine scale. But having said that, the maximum rate of parasitism observed in this study, in Buchanan's study, was only 20%, although he did refer to previous observations of over 60%. So I think it's fair to say then that parasitoids like Metaphycus might be able to make a contribution to suppressing scale insects, but we should never run away with the idea that there's some kind of panacea or silver bullet solution to scale insect problems. A word about Metaphycus, like most parasitoid wasps, they are pretty small. They've got a body length of about 2 millimeters. So even though the coloration of this particular species is fairly distinctive, you'd be doing well to kind of visualize that reliably in the field. Okay, I'd like to just now move on and talk then about the observations that we made on parasitoids in this study. And what I'll try to do now, if technology is going to be my friend, is just show you a brief video clip that will give you an idea of the method used here. Okay, so I hope that video played okay for you, and I also hope that I'm now back on presentation mode with my PowerPoint slides. I'm going to assume that's okay unless somebody unmutes and says, no, Jeff, it's not working. But anyway, the findings.
Yeah, it's working.
Yeah, thank you for confirming. That's great. So the findings from this vacuum collection exercise in the 6 vineyards that I've introduced to you was that we found 669 parasitoid individuals, and based on microscopic visualization, they were sorted into 165 morphospecies, and 2 known scale insect parasitoids were detected amongst those. One was Metaphycus, the species that I mentioned a few slides ago from the Buchanan study. This was the most common, but only present in 2 of our 6 vineyards. And the second species we found was Ophalosia, the one that you can see pictured here, but that was only present in 1 of our 6 vineyards. Now, what that means is that it effectively reinforces the conclusion that I put to you from the Buchanan work, that whilst parasitoids might be a useful contributor towards IPM or suppression of scale insects, by no means are they some kind of silver bullet solution. Now, because we found low numbers of scale insect specific parasitoids in our study, certainly too few to do any kind of fancy statistical analyses with, what I'm going to show you here is a kind of a zoomed out view. This is the total parasitoid. So it's parasitic, it's wasps that we're confident are parasitoids and so attack various types of insects, but not all of them, of course, are going to attack scale insects. Many of them would attack other types of grapevine pests, And some of them would be attacking insects that are of no direct significance to vineyards at all. So with total parasitoids, we had high enough numbers to do summary statistics with. And I'm showing them here for 5 of the vineyards and for the summer sampling periods. This sampling wasn't done in the winter. Again, we're seeing relatively noisy data, but it's clear that the cooler district vineyard was amongst the sites with the most parasitoids. We see that here. And the organic vineyard, which is this little panel here, was amongst those with relatively few parasitoids present. And the other message, I think, from these data is that we had inconsistency across successive summers. You see, perhaps for vineyard number 1 and vineyard number 5 particularly, high numbers of parasitoids in 2024, but that didn't necessarily translate to high numbers of parasitoids the following season for reasons that are not clear. Okay, so having spoken about parasitoids and not exactly poured cold water on them as a control mechanism, but try to manage expectations that they will be a contributor at best towards suppressing scale insects. Let's switch our attention slightly to predators, so away from parasitoids and towards generalist predators that might contribute to scale insect management. Now, the very useful field guide from Mary Ratalak, produced as part of her Eco Vineyards program, does provide some useful information about some of the generalist predators that we can find in vineyards and that will potentially attack scale insects. But if we were to look at the possibility of doing mass releases of these predators as a way to kind of more proactively suppress scale insects, the cost of this can be really quite significant. So for Cryptolemus, this quite spectacular sort of two-toned predatory beetle, it can be purchased from commercial insectary companies, but the costs work out to be about $3,500 a hectare if one were to try and treat in a very kind of broad, spatially broad manner. And so I think really the funding side of the equation here would mean that this is for hotspot treatment only, rather than trying to treat the whole vineyard, because you quickly go broke with that. The other natural enemy, the other predator that's available commercially and is considered to be useful against scale insects is the green lacewing. Now here, trying to estimate the costs is tricky because they are sold as eggs. And if we were to make the assumption that every egg successfully develops into an actively predating larva or adult, then the cost of that would be, quite reasonable, about $20 per hectare. But the reality is that probably survival of these eggs would be perhaps 10% at best. So the cost would be, at least $200 per hectare. So whilst more affordable, it may be an approach that is, again, best suited for hotspot treatment of scale infestation rather than trying to treat a whole vineyard. So the outlook, I think, for scale control by mass release of predators is that it's going to be a very costly measure, and it's largely unproven in vineyards. I mean, it's widely used in other sorts of horticultural and broadacre system, but to a large degree, it's unproven in vineyards and not widely practiced. But what about other approaches for predators and that might also help for parasitoids? And I'm thinking here, of course, about strategies like using ground cover vegetation that might take the form of an insectary planting and encourage a build-up of naturally occurring predators and parasitoids, which, if that could be accomplished, would avoid the need to go to the trouble of expensive releases. So let's just consider these kind of cover crop based approaches. A constraint to keep in mind, though, is that these ants, that I've mentioned previously, are going to be our nemesis here, because any kind of parasitoid or predator that you're trying to encourage will have to somehow cope with the ants that are protecting their precious scale insects. But one method that's spoken about in the literature is the use of this plant, common vetch. Reportedly, it's used in Californian vineyards as a way to attract the ants away from the scale insects on the vines. And it does that because it produces lots of nectar, not only from the flowers themselves, but also, like many legumes, it has these structures here called extrafloral nectaries, which produce nectar. It's just it's produced from this little patch of non-floral tissue, and the ants will feed there on nectar. And the idea, of course, is that if the vetch is producing enough nectar, the ants will not bother going up onto the vines. So potentially there's a few pros attached to this approach. I mean, if we assume it works, certainly vetch is cheap and easy to obtain. It'll cost you about $100 to sow a hectare of this, very affordable. And it also fixes nitrogen. It can be used as a forage crop. It can be incorporated at the end of the season into the soil, and so it will sequester atmosphere from the atmosphere. It's drought hardy, and according to the literature, at least, it may suppress some nematode pests by the kind of compounds it releases from its roots, and also when it breaks down in the soil after incorporation. So, you know, that's quite an attractive package of benefits, but there are some important cons or disadvantages to bear in mind. Importantly, there is a weak evidence base for its efficacy against scale. I've not been able to find a single peer-reviewed paper that actually measured and substantiates this notion of it working. And in Australia, this plant is considered to be a weed in some areas and some circumstances, so use with caution. There are the logistical complications of cover crop establishment and management. This is an extra kind of series of operations for the vineyard manager to grapple with. And it's an annual plant, so it had to be resown each season. And also, it's typically sown in the autumn, and so it may senesce before the warm-up time of the year, when we really need to try and have the scale insect suppressed. So the phenology might not be ideal. Perhaps more importantly, this is a climbing plant, and so it might grow into the vines. And even if it doesn't, it's tall, well over a metre, and so it's going to impede airflow, and therefore there's a greater risk of frost damage, and the humidity might encourage fungal diseases. So my message about this technology is, I think, use with caution, because there is this weak evidence base, and it's completely untested in Australia, and there are some significant cons. Now, to look at a potential alternative, some of you might have attended the webinar I delivered probably about 2 years ago on an earlier Wine Australia funded project, in which we looked at the potential benefits of having undervine plantings or mid-row plantings of various other sorts of plant species, like buckwheat or alyssum. And the benefits of these plants is that they produced a very large amount of nectar, which was suitable for various parasitic wasps and other beneficial insects. Also, the ones that we tested were nice and short. So this brown bar here shows you the height of the spontaneous vegetation in our vineyard trials. These were grasses and a few broadleaf weeds, getting up to about 40 centimetres on average. But all these plant species that were used as alternative ground covers were much, much shorter and more prostrate in growth habit. So it avoids that practical problem I referred to with the vetch. Additionally, these plant species that we tested in the earlier project gave us very good levels of control of light brown apple moth, or elbam as we often call it. And it's particularly apparent here for this plant species, alyssum. And you can see that compared with our control treatment, which is the spontaneous vegetation, we're getting far lower levels of bunches attacked by elbam here on this Anglong vineyard, but also at Balmoral, where we tested this out. And those reduced levels of elbam attack the bunches also have the knock-on benefit of reducing the level of botrytis bunch rot in those vineyards. So let's just look at the future prospects for enhancing biocontrol of scale and potentially other pests, because whilst it might be tempting to try and focus our attention on a particular pest that might be a major problem on one site in 1 year, the main game, of course, is to try and manage things in a slightly more holistic way so that we're putting in place measures that will suppress pests across the board, all types of pests, rather than an overly reductionist approach. So I think a focus on ground covers is worthwhile, but I would recommend using low-growing species, such as those tested in that earlier Wine Australia project, and to aim to promote a suite of natural enemies, including generalist predators and not just parasitoids like Metaphycus. We also need, I suggest, to look at the big picture, the overall basket of ecosystem services or benefits that potentially can be promoted by ground covers. And in this next slide here, I've tried to give you perhaps a mental, an image that you might carry with you after the presentation to try and capture this notion about there being potentially multiple benefits that can be gained from using plants strategically in the vineyard as ground covers. So yeah, we might, if we choose them well, be able to boost levels of biological control, but also achieve a number of additional ecosystem services. That's these other blades on our Swiss Army penknife. So we can suppress weeds, fix nitrogen, use them as a forage crop, green manure, sequester carbon, reduce erosion, suppress diseases, and so on. So these are very tangible and immediate short-term benefits that can come from appropriate cover crops. But looking ahead just a little bit, I think there's great scope in Australia for us to follow in the footsteps of some overseas industries in the area of green finance. So what I mean by this is payment for ecosystem services systems or carbon offsets. And a new project that I'm leading with Wine Australia in conjunction with the One Basin CRC, which is just kicking off at the moment, is exploring these green finance measures and how they could be implemented in Australia. And perhaps I can report back on that in a couple of years. All right, so much for gazing into the crystal ball of the future. What about the immediate IPM adoptions for scale insect pests? So with this graphic here, I'm putting back up that simplified life cycle diagram that I showed you at the top of the show, but superimposed onto that in yellow highlighting is a few kind of annotations there about the management of grapevine scale insects. So what would happen as we move out of winter, or even winter now, is that it's the easiest time to detect the scale insects because you've got mature nymphs, relatively large, and they're gradually completing their development into the mature female with that characteristic scale protective covering over her body. So the lack of foliage makes them easy to visualize. Where hotspots are found, they can be hit hard with pruning operations to try and remove a good deal of that scale infestation. And of course, a winter oil, a paraffin-based oil, can be sprayed during the winter. It's important that that's applied during vine dormancy because of phytotoxicity. You can't use that when there's foliage around. Moving on through the season, after egg hatching occurs in the spring, a spot spray can be applied. And if you want guidance on the sorts of products that are available, I'd recommend this AWRI fact sheet, which contains some very useful information on the options there. Looking for these crawlers or nymphs is tricky because they're tiny, but you can look out for ants that I've mentioned previously, and also look out for the early signs of sooty mold growing on the foliage. Later in the season, spot sprays can be used again, and then releases of predators, if that was going to be attempted for hotspot control, could be done any time during these warmer parts of the growing season. You wouldn't release them in the winter. And then once we get to autumn, that's when vetch would be sowed, if anyone wanted to give that approach a try. And then complementing that, potentially tillage could be used to disrupt the ants' nests, at least in the interrow area. Okay, so that's a summary of the options that I think are available to growers at the moment. And my final slide then is just to try and pull things together with a few major findings. So we found that scale insects were common in New South Wales vineyards, even when they weren't suspected by the owner or manager, but their distributions were very patchy. Grapevine scale was the most common species, and these were commonly tended by ants, which is useful because it helps us detect those infestations. Many dozens of parasitoid wasps were present in the sampled vineyards, but few of those were scale insect specialists. A suggestion from the edge effect results is that it'd be useful, I think, to check for scale insects in neighbouring perennial horticultural crops and in landscaping shrubs around buildings on the property, in case you find they are sort of a harbour or a refuge for scale insects that could spill over into the nearby vineyards. We didn't find any major effects of organic versus conventional management, and we didn't find any major effects either on the nature of the ground covers that were used in that small number of vineyards we sampled, nor indeed of the wider landscape structure. Common vetch that I've spoken about at length previously may attract ants and scale, and it may boost biocontrol, but there is a weak evidence base for this as a viable method. There is, I believe, scope to use the sorts of ground cover plants tested in the earlier Wine Australia project, particularly given that they are short growing plants, and we were able to demonstrate measurable levels of suppression of LBAM and bunch rot. So for the immediate future, I think the way to go with scale insect control is IPM, integrated pest management. And on that note, all I need to do is thank AWRI for this opportunity to speak in the webinar series, and Wine Australia for funding those two projects that you see named there. So thanks very much. I'm happy to take some questions now.
Thanks, Jeff. That was great. There's actually been a few questions come through, and I'll just remind everyone, if they want to ask a question, please type into the Q&A toolbar or the Q&A and press send, and they'll come through. So might start here. So regarding the apparent benefit of the adjacent grasslands in lowering scale numbers, did any of the vineyards have permanent grassed mid-row?
I believe that most of the vineyards had grassy mid-rows. This was spontaneous grassy vegetation rather than sort of deliberately sown to particular specially chosen grass species. But I will make sure that full information on that aspect is provided in the, excuse me, in the final report, which we'll be submitting at the end of this month. So those interested can get the full lowdown very soon.
Okay. Is there any chance that introducing other parasitoids, classic biocontrol, is an option to pursue?
Look, I'm a little bit cold on that idea, despite being a big fan of biocontrol in general, for the reason that any biological control program that is going to bring in exotic natural enemies has got a slow burn. It's going to be at least 5-year journey to do the overseas prospecting, the quarantine work, the specificity testing, and then the rearing. So it's going to be a slow burn. And I think associated with that, extremely costly. I've been involved in a few such projects, some that were not funded because it was a slow payback for a big investment, and one that did go ahead, but it was a very, very extravagantly funded project. I can't see it being viable in this instance, to be honest. I'd be very happy to be corrected by what plays out in the future or other people's plans, but I wouldn't sort of bet my house on that being the way to kind of achieve a breakthrough.
Okay. The next question is, can you please provide an example of a suitable cover crop for assisting with scale control in warm inland regions?
Well, look, we don't know. What I would say is that there is this thing called a cover crop finder tool, which is available online, to which the work that I've conducted has been a contribution. Other researchers in Australia have also contributed to this. And so you're able, using this cover crop finder tool, to enter information on your geographical location, so whether it's a warm production district or a cool district, and what your major concern is, whether it's erosion control, suppressing pests, or some other imperative. And then this tool will, via a relatively simple algorithm, generate some recommendations for you. But to give a one example to illustrate here, I think the white plant that I showed on one of my slides called alyssum, the scientific name is Lobularia maritima, is a very useful plant to use in vineyards because it flowers virtually year round. It's extremely hardy, both in terms of cold tolerance, but also drought tolerance for summer months in warm areas. And whilst it's an annual, it will self-seed. And so once you've established it, it will persist from year after year. And we have shown that alyssum produces lots of nectar and is beneficial to a wide range of natural enemies, not just from my vineyard work, but from other work in other crop systems. So alyssum is one that perhaps be worthwhile. The question I'm doing some web searching on, because that's a potential goer.
Okay. There's another question come through. Do you have any comments on why the cooler site vineyards may have greater parasitoid numbers?
Yeah, look, I suspect the reason was because of the relatively cool conditions. Most parasitoids don't like really hot, dry conditions. And so it's entirely possible that in the riverina sites, things were just so hot and dry that parasitoids weren't active at the time when the vacuum samples were taken. But in the cooler district vineyard, because conditions were not so dehydrating and thermal stress for the parasitoids, there are more of them around. So that's my feeling there.
Okay. Another question come through here regarding, is anything known on the effect of sprays such as sulfur on the parasitoids?
I honestly don't know. I suspect this is going to be a slightly sort of generic answer. I suspect that the main effect on scale insects would be an indirect one via the effect of sulfur on natural enemies. While sulfur might have an effect on the younger scale, particularly at the young crawler stage when they're tiny and fragile, most likely the effects are going to be via taking out their natural enemies. But I'm not aware of any particular studies that sort of underpin that assertion from me.
Okay, following on slightly, how often would you recommend monitoring, and what method would you use as part of an IPM?
I think the key periods for monitoring would be during the winter months when the foliage is absent, of course, and it's easier to get eyes onto the scales themselves. And that's timely because then you can follow up with a hard prune in hotspot areas and use a paraffin spray or a winter oil. So that would be, I think, low-hanging fruit in terms of a benefit, an immediate benefit from monitoring at that stage. But then during the growing season, it would be worthwhile looking in the vineyard, probably not in a kind of really regimented fortnightly or monthly structured sampling program, but just as one is going about normal vineyard operations, to keep an eye open for honeydew, for sooty mold, and for ant activity, because during the growing season, they're going to be the easiest way to kind of spot an infestation, an area that's a hotspot.
And a couple of others come through. This one's a little bit longer. I'll read it out. Regarding the life cycle of scale, it was theorized there is only one generation per season. Do we know enough about the life cycle of the various scale species to definitively understand the pest properly? Rather than jumping to solutions, do we need to direct further funding to scale studies? Comparing to, say, powdery mildew, we understand the pathogen really well and can control very precisely. By comparison with it feels like we're flying blind with this pest. Sorry, it was quite a long question.
No, that's fine. And it's the sort of kind of issue that's raised fairly often in discussions and workshops and so on. And the short answer is no, we don't know enough about this. And particularly given that there's a handful of species that might be found in New South Wales vineyards, whilst we might have a reasonably good understanding or a fair level of confidence about grapevine scale. For the other species, I think we've got a weaker evidence base for that notion of it being univoltine or one generation a year. So I think there's a gap in knowledge there. And leading on from that, I'd say that yes, it probably is worth some research investment to address that gap. We were not able in this study that I've reported on today to shine as much light on it as we were hoping to at the outset, mostly because we found very, very low numbers of species other than grapevine scale. And it's quite possible that if we had a better understanding of the life cycles, numbers of generations and so on, that could lead to some useful tweaks to management.
Okay, another one. Noting crawlers can be wind dispersed. Did you see any patterns in scale distribution and predominant wind direction and surrounding structures / vegetation?
We didn't know. not aside from those sort of headline results that I showed, where there was edge effects based on the nature of the land use adjacent to the vineyard.
Okay, there's a couple of others here. Have you initiated any work across other suffocant type products other than the paraffinic oils, such as potassium fatty acids or orange oil?
No, that was very clearly beyond the scope of this study, and I'm not actually aware of any current work that's investigating those alternatives.
Just wondering if there's a correlation between high vine leaf bricks, vine nutrition, and a reduction in scale.
I'm not aware of any published work on this. No,
Okay.
Can't address that one.
I'll just read this one out. It's a long one. Given the relationship between scale farmers, ants, and scale populations, is there merit in directing our attention to ant population reduction strategies? You referenced tillage, but this is perhaps more of a disturbance rather than an eradication strategy. And does the introduction of ant attractive nectar sources not ultimately increase the ant population?
Yeah, I don't think we know enough about the field ecology of ant populations to answer that with any degree of confidence. I would make the comment that if we were to take at face value these reports of common vetch succeeding in Californian vineyards, succeeding as diverting the ants away from scale insects on vines down to the vineyard floor, then that would suggest that providing a kind of a decoy source of nectar didn't end up kind of being an own goal in building up the local densities of ants and therefore ending up with more scales. So if those Californian reports are accurate, there may be other measures, such as my suggestion to focus on ground cover plant species other than vetch, would likely not increase numbers of ants in the system. And bear in mind that there are plenty of natural enemies of ants, and so there are going to be some kind of natural checks and balances on ants that would most likely not allow them to really flare up if we were to provide these nectiferous ground covers.
All right, I might leave it there, Jeff, taking us through your extensive work on vineyard pests and in particular scale insects and the findings. I'm sure everyone who got a lot out of the session. It's been quite a good Q&A session at the end here as well. I'm sure everyone who attended got a lot, and I'd also like to thank the audience for logging in and taking part. I'd just like to remind you that, as always, you will receive a link to a copy of this via the Adabry's YouTube channel, and that should be available within the next 24 hours. The next Adabry webinar will be on Thursday, the 26th of June, with another insect-related webinar, but this time we're looking at the insect bioconversion of winery waste. So look out for the advertisement of this one coming soon. And if you'd like to register, please visit the Adabry website. So I'd just like to thank you again as the audience, and also thank you, Jeff, for coming along today. And I look forward to seeing you for the next Adabry webinar. Thanks again.
Thank you.